In 1942, a letter arrived at the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin. It was a formal diplomatic request from an Iranian official in Paris, and it made an outrageous claim. The letter argued that a specific group of people who followed the laws of Moses were not racially Jewish. The author called them Djuguten and insisted they were an entirely separate community, an ancient Iranian tribe that had simply adopted a new faith centuries ago. He presented this as a historical fact, a forgotten truth that the German authorities had overlooked. The claim was audacious, almost unbelievable. But here's the most shocking part. The German High Command, the very architects of the final solution, actually bought it. They accepted this argument, and as a result, hundreds of people were spared from the death camps. The man behind this brilliant high-stakes deception was an Iranian diplomat named Abdol Hossein Sardari. But the story gets even crazier. This so-called Djuguten community, it didn't exist. The word Djuguten? He made it up. It was a complete fabrication, a historical bluff played on the world's most dangerous regime, all to save innocent lives. This is the story of how one man outsmarted an entire empire with nothing but his wits, his courage, and a single perfectly crafted lie. Before the darkness fell over Europe, Abdol Hossein Sardari was living the high life in Paris. He was the quintessential playboy diplomat. Young, handsome, and from a wealthy Iranian family, he was known for throwing the most lavish parties in the city. His apartment was a magnet for socialites, artists, and foreign dignitaries. He drove a Rolls-Royce, wore the finest suits, and was a regular at the city's most exclusive clubs. By all accounts, Sardari was not what you would call a devout Muslim. His lifestyle was far more focused on earthly pleasures than religious obligations. He was a man enjoying the peak of Parisian society, seemingly detached from the looming storm clouds of war. But in the spring of 1940, that storm broke. The German army marched into Paris, and the City of Lights was plunged into darkness. The French government collapsed. Foreign embassies scrambled to evacuate. The Iranian ambassador, along with most of the diplomatic staff, fled the city, leaving the consulate in chaos. But one man chose to stay. Abdol Hossein Sardari, the party-loving diplomat, was suddenly the only one left in charge. The keys to the Iranian consulate and the fate of every Iranian citizen in France were now in his hands. He was alone, surrounded by an occupying force that was already beginning its grim work. The occupation of Paris began with paperwork. The new rulers were meticulous, obsessed with order and categorization. They immediately began identifying and registering everyone, creating lists based on ancestry and religious affiliation. For the city's Jewish population, this was the first step toward total annihilation. Sardari watched in horror as families he knew, friends and neighbors, were rounded up. He realized that among the Iranian community in Paris were many families of the Jewish faith. They were Iranian citizens, yes, but he knew the occupiers wouldn't care about their passports. Their faith marked them for the camps. Sardari was a diplomat, trained in negotiation and international law, not a soldier. He had no army, no weapons. All he had was his title and his intellect. He had to find a way to protect his people, to build a legal fortress around them that even the Germans would have to respect. He began poring over the occupiers' own twisted ideology, looking for a weakness, a loophole, any crack in their armor he could exploit. And then he found one. It was a single word, a concept the Germans themselves revered above all else: Aryan. Sardari knew that the occupiers were obsessed with the idea of a pure Aryan race. They saw themselves as its modern inheritors. But Sardari, an Iranian, knew the true history. The word Aryan comes from ancient Persia, modern-day Iran. Iranians were, historically and linguistically, the original Aryans. This was his opening. Armed with this historical fact, Sardari began a bold diplomatic campaign. He sent official communications to the German authorities, arguing that since Iranians were the true, original Aryans, they should be exempt from all racial laws. He wasn't just making a casual point. He was using their own logic against them. It was a masterful move. He forced the bureaucrats in Berlin to confront a contradiction in their own doctrine. After a series of tense negotiations, the Germans reluctantly agreed. They conceded that Iranians, as a people, were exempt. It was a huge victory, but Sardari knew it wasn't enough. The exemption was for Iranians as a nationality, not for Jews as a faith. The authorities made it clear. Any Iranian citizen identified as Jewish would still be targeted. Sardari had won a battle, but the war for their lives was far from over. He needed another, even more audacious plan. This is where the story goes from clever diplomacy to sheer genius. Sardari couldn't deny that these families practiced Judaism. So, he decided to redefine what that meant. He sat down and drafted a formal letter, a masterpiece of historical fiction. In it, he claimed that there was a group of Iranians he called Djuguten. He explained that these were not racial Jews in the way the Germans understood it. Instead, they were an ancient community of ethnic Iranians who, centuries ago, had been converted to the faith of Moses. He argued they had no ancestral connection to European Jews. They were, in his words, Musak, followers of Moses, but ethnically pure Iranian. The term Djuguten itself was a brilliant piece of misdirection. It sounded vaguely academic, slightly obscure, just plausible enough to be believed. He presented this not as an opinion, but as a forgotten historical fact he was simply bringing to their attention. He was playing a dangerous game, betting everything on the Germans' bureaucratic arrogance, their belief that they knew everything, and their unwillingness to admit they might have missed a small detail in their racial encyclopedia. He sent the letter and waited. The fate of hundreds of people hung on this single, magnificent lie. The bluff worked. The German authorities, likely confused by the confident, academic tone of the letter, and unwilling to challenge a diplomatic representative on his own country's history, accepted Sardari's Djuguten theory. They issued a directive. Iranian citizens of the Musak faith were not to be persecuted. They were protected. With this official protection secured, Sardari went into overdrive. He knew a piece of paper from Berlin might not be enough to stop a suspicious officer on a Parisian street. His people needed irrefutable proof of their status. So he began issuing hundreds of new Iranian passports. He didn't just replace old ones. He created new identities. He issued them to Iranian Jews, giving them the official documentation that backed up his lie. But he didn't stop there. His mission of mercy expanded. He started giving blank passports to non-Iranian Jews, to anyone who came to him for help. With a stamp and a signature, he could transform a person marked for death into a protected Iranian citizen overnight. Each passport was a lifeline, but it was also a piece of evidence. Sardari was creating a mountain of fraudulent documents, and every single one put his own life at greater risk. He was no longer just bending the rules. He was shattering them. Just as his rescue operation was at its peak, Sardari's world collapsed. In 1943, his own government in Tehran, under pressure from the Allied powers, declared war on Germany. Overnight, his diplomatic status vanished. He was no longer an official representative of a neutral country. He was now an enemy alien in an occupied city. His diplomatic immunity was gone. His salary was cut off. The Iranian government, now allied with Britain and Russia, ordered him to close the consulate and return home immediately. But Sardari looked at the hundreds of passports he had issued. He knew that if he left, the protection they offered would be worthless. The moment the consulate closed, the Djuguten would cease to exist, and the people holding his passports would be exposed. So he made a decision that sealed his fate. He disobeyed his own government. He refused to leave Paris. He kept the consulate running, using his own personal savings to pay the rent and expenses. The man who once spent his fortune on lavish parties was now using it to fund a secret rescue mission, becoming poorer with every life he saved. He was trapped, without a country's protection, surrounded by enemies, risking arrest and execution every single day, all to keep his promise. For the remainder of the war, Abdol Hossein Sardari lived as a ghost. He was a diplomat with no diplomacy, a citizen with no country's backing, a hero operating in the shadows. He continued his work, quietly helping people navigate the treacherous landscape of occupied Paris, ensuring their documents were honored, and intervening whenever he could. When Paris was finally liberated in 1944, his work was done. By conservative estimates, he saved over 2,000 lives, not just the Iranian Djuguten, but French, Polish, and other European Jews as well. And what was his reward? Nothing. After the war, he was charged by his own government for misconduct and misuse of embassy resources for issuing all those passports. He had to spend years fighting to clear his name. He never asked for recognition. He never sought medals or accolades. He faded back into obscurity, living a quiet life in London, and, eventually, back in Paris. When asked, much later in life, why he did it, why he risked everything, his career, his fortune, his life, his answer was simple. He said, "It was my duty." It was his duty as a diplomat to protect his citizens, and his duty as a human being to help others in distress. He was a playboy who became a savior, a man of worldly tastes who showed profound humanity. He wasn't a saint, but in the darkest of times, Abdol Hossein Sardari became a hero, proving that courage can be found in the most unexpected of places.